Hello, I'm Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. This is the first in a series of online presentations about climate history and climate science history. There's a tremendous amount of climate misinformation being dispersed, one top theme being that the climate is becoming more extreme. There's no evidence to back this up. In today's presentation, I discussed the year 1936, which was a very extreme year. It was during the Dust Bowl when millions fled the Great Plains to escape the extreme heat and drought. But 1936 wasn't just hot, it was also extremely cold. February of 1936 was the coldest February on record in the US. Niagara Falls froze solid and Montana had temperatures of minus 60 degrees. A few weeks later in March was one of the worst floods in US history. This newspaper article reported that one-fourth of the US was flooded, including 100 cities in 14 eastern states. And at the same time, a massive dust storm raged in the western U.S. During that flood, Pittsburgh was under 10 feet of water on March 20th, 1936. My grandfather was at a business meeting there that day and had to be evacuated by boat. After the floods came food shortages and disease. The Ohio River was 60 feet deep. Washington, D.C. was also flooded, and the White House had to be sandbagged to keep the water out. Hundreds of people were killed. The flood went all up and down the East Coast. If that wasn't bad enough, 2 weeks later came one of the worst tornado outbreaks in history. During the first week of April 1936, a massive tornado outbreak killed hundreds of people in 6 southern states. Tupelo, Mississippi, and Gainesville, Georgia were hardest hit. It was the only time 2 different tornadoes killed more than 100 people on the same day. And then, not long after that, came the hottest summer on record in the U.S. About one person died from the heat every minute during the worst of the heat wave in July. Morgues could not keep up. Temperatures in 1936 were incomprehensibly hot by modern standards. Almost the entire U.S. was over 100 degrees. Much of the Midwest was over 110 degrees, including Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. North Dakota was 118 degrees. South Dakota was 119 degrees. These sort of temperatures are rarely, if ever, seen even in Phoenix, Arizona. To give a feel for just how hot it was, during the summer of 1936, almost 60% of the U.S. had 20 or more days over 95 degrees. The 1930s were extremely hot, much hotter than now. There was another heat wave in the 1950s and another in the 1980s. The last summer with widespread heat in the U.S. was the summer of 1988, when NASA's James Hansen told Congress that summers would be getting much hotter due to the greenhouse effect. In fact, the climate has done the exact opposite. Summers have gotten much cooler in the U.S. over the last 80 years. Similarly, the frequency of hot days in the U.S. has plummeted. It's down almost 50% over the last 80 years. We used to get about 7.5% of our days were over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we have about 4%. You can see it's gone down, and it's been in record lows in recent years. As far as record high temperatures go, almost one-fourth of U.S. all-time record high temperatures were set in the year 1936, and a lot in the years in the 30s prior to that. Over the last 15 years, there's been very few all-time record high temperatures. Summers have not been hot in the U.S. recently. 1936 was not just hot, extremely hot, as I mentioned before, it was also extremely cold. This graph shows the percentage of days which were either over 100 degrees or below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. See, in 1936, almost 10% of days were either extremely hot or extremely cold. Now compare with 2016, which was one of the least extreme years on record. There were very few hot or cold days in 2016. Now compare this with the rhetoric that we hear that 2016 was an extreme year. The only thing that was extreme about it was extremely mild. Steinbeck wrote poignantly about the heat and drought of the 1930s. Unfortunately, few people are old enough to remember. If we had a repeat of 1936 now, many climate scientists would say they're certain it was due to atmospheric carbon dioxide, but they would be wrong. CO2 was only 305 parts per million in 1936. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a very long time. See you again soon.